What I'm about to teach you is probably the most important lesson on this video. We're going to talk about exposure control, which is really brightness control. And then we're going to talk about the focusing systems, probably the second most important lesson on this video. But exposure control is where most people struggle in the beginning. It's confusing. These are new terms that you don't know. So just hang in there and I will walk you through it. So let's talk about the mode dial real quick. It's on top of our camera here. And as we rotate it, you're going to see these mode indicators changing. The dummy mode, which is really a green box mode, you'll notice that we lose so many of our settings, and the camera is going to do most of the heavy lifting for us. In fact, there's very little we can change in here. It's basically turning your camera into a point and shoot, almost like a cell phone camera. It's just going to do everything for you. You did not spend this kind of money on a camera to shoot on the dummy mode. So if you are highly confused about everything, I would recommend starting on the P mode. I don't even really like that. I kind of want my students shooting in aperture priority mode, but with P mode, at least you have more control over the dummy mode. In fact, I was just on a safari with a brand new photographer, and he didn't, I had an extra camera that I actually lent to him, and he didn't know how to use it. And I said, look, just shoot on the P mode. I'm here if you have any questions. And he just shot on P mode for the whole trip, right? But if I am mentoring you, what I will tell you is to start off in aperture priority mode. There's really 4 modes that you should really be aware of: manual, aperture priority, shutter priority, and the P mode. There's a hybrid mode called FV mode. We'll talk about that in a second. But for now, I want you to focus on aperture priority mode. Now, the reason why I like aperture priority mode is because it's very easy to understand. I think it is. Aperture priority means that we dial in the aperture in the camera. So if you remember, I was talking about primary selector, numero uno. It changes from the primary dial. 1, our index finger on the primary dial. Watch what happens when I rotate this primary dial. You'll notice that the f-stop is changing. And again, the way f-stops work is that smaller numbers like f4 are wider openings, and much higher numbers result in smaller openings. So as I rotate the primary selector wheel in aperture priority, we are changing the primary setting, which is the aperture. So this is how we change the aperture. Now, something you should be wondering, you're saying, Michael, this doesn't make any sense. If you're changing the size of the opening of the lens, if you're making it larger and smaller, how come it's not changing the brightness of the image? It should, right? If we're going with a small opening, there's less light, it should become darker. So the secret of aperture priority is that the camera is making changes to the shutter speed. And we can prove it by tapping the shutter button, and we can see our shutter speed. It's not highlighted in such a way that we can change, but as we change the aperture, now you can see the camera is changing the shutter speed simultaneously. This is the heart of the matter with aperture priority. We select the aperture, and the camera selects the shutter speed. And because of this, we're getting a nice even exposure. If we have a very wide opening, the camera selects a faster shutter speed. If we have a very small opening like f22, now we're using a longer shutter speed. So this is a really important concept to understand, is that the camera is helping us. It's allowing us to say, camera, do the shutter speed for me. Now, there's actually a little bit more to this. And take your camera, open up the aperture as wide as it will go, the lowest F number. If you're in a dark room, this may not work very well, so you've got to have some light to work with. Tap the shutter button so you can see the shutter speed, and then you're going to take your hand and slowly move it in front of the lens. And as you block the light, what you'll notice is the shutter speed is changing. And so what's happening is the camera adjusts the shutter speed not only based on the aperture, but also based on the amount of light entering the lens. That's what's happening. As we block the lens, it's trying to use a longer shutter speed to let more light in. One of the most common questions I get is, why is my shutter speed so slow in aperture priority mode? And the answer is, you're probably shooting in a low light situation. Go outside on a bright sunny day and you'll notice the shutter speed will get faster. When I shot weddings professionally, I would almost exclusively shoot on aperture priority mode during the event. And I'll give you an example. Let's say we're inside a church, it's kind of dark, and I'm shooting, and here comes the bride and the groom, they're walking down the aisle. So I got to back up as I'm shooting, right? Now I'm in the lobby. It's a little bit brighter in the lobby. And you only get 5 or 10 seconds as they're walking through that lobby to get those shots. I don't want to have to fumble with my shutter speed. So as I move into brighter conditions, the camera is using faster shutter speeds, and that works for me. And now we're outside, and now it's really sunny, really bright, and the camera is going to use even a faster shutter speed. And I don't have to worry about making those changes on the fly. So when time is short, I typically shoot on aperture priority. If I am in a studio and I have time, then I will shoot in manual. In manual, you dial in all the settings. I don't want to get off track right now. Sport shooting, almost always shoot aperture priority. Why? Because sometimes you get cloud cover and I'm shooting and I don't want to have to change my shutter speed as I'm shooting sports. I just let the camera deal with the shutter speed. Now, having said all this, there is a very important thing to remember, is that if our shutter speed gets too long, it's going to be blurry. So there's some rules of thumb that I use, and when I'm shooting, I just sneak these little peaks over here toward my shutter speed. If I am hand holding the camera and I am shooting portraits or landscapes, if I'm hand holding, almost always want to be at least 1/60th of a second. If it gets longer than 1/60th of a second, we're going to run into some blurriness problems. The second rule of thumb is that if I'm shooting sports, I typically like to see 1/500th of a second. Now, it depends on the sport and the athlete and what they're doing and how fast they're moving. Some sports require 1/1000th, 1/2000th. It just really depends. But minimum for shooting sports, I'm typically at 1/500th of a second. So I'll sneak a peek as I'm shooting just to make sure that I'm at that 1/500th. Those are the two barriers you should keep in mind: 1/60th of a second for portraits and landscape, 1/500th of a second for the beginning of slow moving sports. Now, I want to take this a step further and teach you the skill of changing the brightness of your images in aperture priority mode. This is where the exposure compensation bar comes from. You'll notice here on the bottom, we have a -3, -2, -1. It's like a diamond home plate, 1, 2, and 3 plus. So the short answer on this is to take a picture of something. I'm going to change my cluster here, make it a little bit larger. Let's see here, as this go here. Focus. So I'm going to take a picture. And let's say I'm reviewing this picture and I just decide, you know what? This is too dark. I want it to be brighter. This is how we do this. You can do it on the monitor or by touching here. And we're just going to move this over to 1. Come back out, take the picture, compare those two images. So here's the brighter one, and here's the more even one. That skill set alone, you're going to use it tens of thousands or hundreds of thousands of times in your photography career, is just changing the brightness. Well, let's say this isn't enough. Let's say we want to make it even brighter. I can come back in, go to 2, take a picture. So in those 3 pictures, you can see there's a difference in brightness. Well, let's say after this picture, I want it darker. We would just go in the opposite direction. Let's go to -1. Negative is darker, -1. So you can see that as we play back, we are controlling the brightness of the image by changing the exposure compensation. We can make it even darker. Here it is at -2. So that is the short answer of how we change the brightness of the image. If we're in aperture priority mode, we are going to change the exposure compensation. Now, you'll notice that I'm changing this in a different way. That if we tap the shutter button to wake up the camera, we can rotate the rear control wheel. This is something that I do when I'm looking through the viewfinder. I'll just come in and do this instead of tapping the monitor and then scrolling to the left or right. So there's two different ways you can change that. Again, using this, or tap the shutter button first. You get the orange indicator, and then we can go up or down. Now I'm going to give you an explanation on the longer side of this because I want you to understand what these numbers mean. What this +1, +2, and what do those actually mean? Those refer to stops of light. You're going to hear that term a lot in your photography career. What is a stop of light? The short answer on this, it is twice as much or half as much of light as another setting. So if I go from 0 to 1, I am adding twice the amount of light as I did before. If I'm going to -1 from 0, now I'm using half as much light. And that's what stops mean. It's double or half the amount of light depending on the previous setting. So I can prove this to you, and this is actually really amazing. It's like I get excited about this. Is if you touch the shutter button, we can see that the shutter speed recommended here is 1/640th. I'm going to actually adjust this just a little bit. So we can see that the shutter speed at the setting is 1/500th of a second. Watch what happens when I come up to +1. Now we're at 1/250th of a second. So if you remember fractions from school, 1/500th plus 1/500th is 2/500ths. And if we're to simplify 2/500ths, well, now we have 1/250th. And that's how we can mathematically prove that we have twice the amount of light based on a longer shutter speed. We've doubled the duration of time that light is hitting the sensor. So let me ask you this. What if we go to +2? What do you think it would be? Now, if you said 1/125th of a second, you're absolutely right. There it is. Why? Because 1/250th plus 1/250th is 2/250ths. If we simplify that, that's 1/125th of a second. And if you guess on +3, if you said 1/60th, you are also absolutely correct. So you can see that this is how exposure compensation works, is that if we're shooting and all our images are a little dark, we can come in and bump it up, maybe 1/3 of a stop. Every tick mark is 1/3. Every number is a whole stop. So when I was shooting weddings, I would almost always be shooting at about here or about here. And that gives the camera instructions to change the brightness by adding a little bit longer of a shutter speed. That's what it means. Now, at 1/500th of a second, what do you think would happen if we went to -1? A shutter speed that is half as long. It's twice as fast. Some of these terms are kind of confusing, but a shutter speed that is 1/2 of 1/500th, that's right, it's 1/1000th of a second. It's faster shutter speed. What if we went to -2? That's right, 1/2000th of a second. And as you could probably guess, if we went to -3, we're at now 1/4000th of a second. So we're using a faster and faster shutter speed to let in less and less light. I know I've thrown a lot at you in this short lesson on exposure. If you study this and you make it a priority, you are going to be in fantastic shape to starting your photography career because you will use these skill sets for the rest of your life. Aperture priority, we dial in the aperture, the camera decides the shutter speed. We can control the brightness by using exposure compensation. And this is achieved by telling the camera to cheat the exposure in one direction or another by changing the shutter speed. We also have a couple barriers, 1/60th of a second for portraits, for shooting handheld, or 1/500th of a second if we're shooting sports. Pretty good summary of what's going on with aperture priority mode. Now what I want to do is flip this over to TV mode. TV mode stands for time value. In our primary selector, numero uno, as we rotate it, you will notice it no longer changes the aperture, it changes the shutter speed. So this is why I call it the primary selector. The primary selector changes the primary setting of the mode that we're shooting in. In this case, it's time value. So as we rotate this, we're changing the time or the shutter speed of the camera And if we tap the shutter button, we can see that the camera is changing the aperture to compensate for this. So we can see this as we change from longer shutter speeds to faster shutter speeds. Something else I want to point out, let's use a longer shutter speed here. Again, if we take our hand and cover the lens, the camera is going to try to let in more light or less light with the aperture. So I have a little question for you. I want you to think about it. Let's say you want to shoot sports on shutter priority mode. A lot of people do this. It's just easier for them to remember, I'm going to dial in my shutter speed and let the camera deal with the aperture, right? Michael said we should be shooting at 1/500th of a second to start. So we come in, oh, something's happening here. It's getting darker. Okay, 1/500th of a second. Wow, that's really dark. You know, if we shoot sports, we're not gonna be able to see these pictures. And then when you tap the shutter button, the aperture starts flashing. Aperture flashing like that means the camera is not happy. And what it's telling us is that it has reached the maximum limit of the opening of the lens. And looking at the exposure, this is going to be dark. So what would you do in this situation? How would you resolve this? You have to shoot at 1/500th of a second. The lens is opened as wide as it will go, and the camera is not happy. Think about it for just a minute. If you said, bump up your ISO, you're absolutely right. We can come in here and bump it up to maybe 3200. Tap the shutter button. The flashing has stopped. This is going to happen to you a lot. And you will also do this with aperture priority mode, is that if you get into a situation, you're hand holding, shutter speed's getting very, very long. Well, yeah, now we need to bump up the ISO to compensate for the loss of light. Now, it's not pure light. This is a boost. It's like a cheat. So we always want to kind of leave it as low as we can. But yeah, in some cases, you're going to have to do this. Bump your ISO up to allow the camera to get the shot. Modern cameras are actually really good. You can shoot at 3200, 6400 sometimes and see very little grain. It's when you get into the extreme ISOs that it becomes a problem. Exposure compensation works similarly, but the adjustments happen with the aperture. So if I wanted to make it brighter, here we go. You can see it just got a little bit brighter. If I wanted to make it darker, it's changing the aperture to make the image brighter or darker. That's how you do it in AV mode or TV mode. Real quick, I wanted to talk about the program mode. Program mode is a little wonky, simply because it doesn't look like we can change our settings. We can, but the way it works is it really gives us combinations where the camera's throwing out different combinations between shutter speeds and apertures, also depending on the light. So in this, if we don't have this highlighted, rotating these dials isn't going to do anything. We tap the shutter button, we get our primary selector is changing our shutter speed. So as we change our shutter speed, the camera's making adjustments to the aperture, and that's how we can manage them in a way. We just look at them and we're looking for the right combination that we want. Maybe you want to shoot at f4, you would rotate it until you got f4, and you're looking at that. It's sort of like taking the training wheels off a little bit, but there's still a lot of help. We can change the brightness by exposure compensation. And the thing about this is you'll see changes to both the shutter speed and the aperture as we change the brightness. Same basic principle though, you can bump it up or bump it down. Program mode is great if you want the camera to help you a lot. And there's nothing wrong with that. And as a further point of clarification, your final image only cares about the shutter speed, aperture, the ISO. The camera doesn't care how you got there. Whether it's manual mode, aperture priority mode, or program mode, those settings are the same in all of those modes in the same lighting situation. There are very high-end professional wedding photographers I know of who shoot in program mode. So don't let that stop you. The main thing is you're competent with the modes. I personally use aperture priority mode and manual mode almost all the time. If I am shooting an event that requires that I have a flash on, I will shoot in the P mode because that is the handheld flash mode for Canon. It's a lot to go into, I know. So let's talk real quick about manual mode. Manual mode is different than the other modes because we dial in the shutter speed, primary selector. We can dial in the aperture. You can see the full orange dot. That's this control. And the camera obeys. We just dial it in. I use manual mode when I have time. Like if I'm in a studio setting with flash, or if I'm not rushed, I'm almost always shooting in manual mode. We can also adjust, obviously, our ISO. We dial in all three settings and the camera obeys us, basically. Something that's interesting you'll notice is the exposure compensation bar. I can't select it now. And in this mode, it is no longer an exposure compensation bar. This is an exposure meter. It's just simply telling us how bright or how dark the image is. If I cover this, it's saying, hey, it's really dark. And if I let in more light, saying, hey, it's pretty bright. So this is a light meter at this point. We don't change exposure compensation in manual mode. There is an exception that I'm about to point out. So we also have this feature where we can come into our ISO and we can put the camera back into auto ISO. There is a time and place for this, and the best example I can think of is MMA fighting. If you're in an MMA arena that's very dark and it has lights coming on and flashing and going, it's a nightmare of a situation to deal with getting those settings right. In that situation, I would come in, I would designate 1/500th of a second for my shutter speed. I would open my aperture as wide as it could go, and then I would leave the ISO on auto. And the reason why you want to do that is because when you have rapid changing lighting conditions, in this case, especially for a sport, the camera would make the adjustments to the ISO. So if you're about to shoot and it's kind of darker and you take the shot and here come all the lights, the camera can make the adjustment to the ISO. And there's a lot of people who love to shoot indoor sports this way, especially when you get rapidly changing lighting conditions or concerts or things of that nature where we don't have control and things are changing a lot. That's the time to shoot in auto ISO. So there is another mode on the R6 Mark II that I want to talk about real quick, and that is the FV mode, the flexible value. And this is very cool. There are people who absolutely love this mode. What the FV mode allows you to do is you can see each of our three settings have auto. We can come in and control our time value. Let's say we decide we want to control the time value only, right? What we do is we come in, we lock it, and the camera will now make adjustments to the aperture or the ISO. Again, we can also change our exposure compensation this way. When we tap the shutter button, it commits to those settings and it remembers them briefly. And then as the shoot goes back on, it would jump back out to auto again. So here. So it's committing to those settings. As long as you see a line underneath those settings, what that means is that camera will jump back to auto. Well, let's say we want regular ISO control, we just dial it in and that line disappears, which means we have a flexible value where the camera is now going to only adjust the aperture. There's some people that love it. I don't recommend my students do this because I want them to learn aperture priority mode first because they're going to get a lot of mileage out of that. So I know it's a lot of information. We've gone over the mode dial. We've talked about each of the four major modes, my recommendations of when you should use them, the different shutter speeds, how to make images brighter or darker. I know it's a lot of information, but if you can just learn that one lesson, you are going to be in fantastic shape. There are a couple more things you'll notice about the mode dial. Let's talk about them real quick. B stands for the bulb mode. This is really better used with the remote shutter. The idea of the bulb mode is that we can have very long exposures by pushing and holding the shutter button down. You can see we get this timer in the bottom right-hand corner, and then when we release it, the exposure ends. This is better for certain kinds of astrophotography, very long exposures. It's pure white because it's overexposed, but that's the bulb mode. You control how long the exposure is by pushing and holding down the shutter. Next on the top, we have three different modes. There's a C1, C2, and C3. Those deal with the custom modes. And the way this works is you would set your camera up to shoot a certain way. Let's say you were shooting portraits and you wanted to shoot wide open, and you would come in and dial in everything that you wanted, from your white balance to your picture styles, your focusing modes, all of that. And once this is set up the way you like it, you would come into your yellow tab, page 6, custom shooting mode, register settings at C1. We're going to hit OK. And what that will do is that when we rotate to that C1, all of those settings are remembered. You can see it even indicates that we saved it as aperture priority mode. This is very handy if you do different genres of shooting. If you're a sports photographer and you also do a lot of portrait photographer, you may want to have it pre-set up so you don't have to set your camera up each time you go to those different kinds of shoots. Or underwater photography, just really depends on your doing. Those are the custom modes. Once we get past C3, we come into the filter modes. Most of these, I consider them to be gimmicky, but there's a couple cool ones in here you should know about. So we can come in and we can choose the filter effect, whether it's grainy black and white, soft focus, there's a fisheye effect. If we were to select this, you can see it's bending the shape of my blinds. There's a water painting effect, toy camera effect, miniature effect, HDR. These are semi-useful, the HDR ones. They're kind of fun to play with. And, if you're in a jam and you need some HDR, this is where you'd come in and set them. But for the most part, I never use these. Then we come into the scene modes. The scene modes are really designed in such a way that you would come in and select what you're doing. So if you're shooting portraits, you would select this. If you're shooting group photos, you do that. Landscapes. We have a panoramic shot, sports shooting, kid shooting, panning with vehicles, macro photography, food photography. We have a night portrait. We have a handheld night scene mode, HDR backlight control, and silent shutter. Silent shutter would come in handy. But the idea on this is that the camera allows you to choose the setting and the subject that you're shooting, and it takes care of everything else. You're going to lose a lot of control and not really understand what the camera's doing if you just select these things and you shoot this way. Some people do this. Panoramic mode is definitely useful when you need it. I stay away from these and I have my students stay away from them because you can accomplish everything you need to if you know the camera settings themselves and how to apply them. This is kind of like a shortcut if you don't want to figure those things out. And when you come into them, what you'll notice is you don't have the control. So for shooting portrait, where did all the camera settings go? You can't change anything, right? Where's the exposure compensation? Where's our white balance? How do we change these settings? If we come in and hit Q, you're going to notice that most of those settings are missing. So we lose a lot of control when we shoot in these scene modes, which is why I do not recommend them. So on your mode dial, this last one, it's like an A with a film strip. This is a hybrid dummy mode, which means it's going to allow you to shoot stills and videos in such a way that you can shoot hybrid. You don't have to, press this button over here. Just tries to make it a little bit more simple. Again, I never use it because if I'm shooting video, I'm in the video mode and I want full control. So that is an overview of our mode dial.